Hi everyone, and welcome. Today we're joined by Colonel Jacques Baud, a former member of a Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service and also an excellent author. So thank you for coming back on the program.
For inviting me again.
So I wanted to talk to you about what's happening in Ukraine because it appears that the air defenses are not functioning as they should. I'm not sure if there's a lack of interceptor missiles or Patriot systems, but the Russians now are increasing the amount of drones as well as missiles. Just the other night, they reached another record, I think, by launching 728 drones plus launching several missiles, and more are going through and hitting their targets. Um, I was wondering if you can elaborate what's happening. What is the extent of damage, and what do you make of this? Or do you think we're reaching a breaking point for Ukraine? Because it seems the less they're able to stop, of course, the more destruction happens on its territory as well. So, are we entering some intensifying collapse here, or how are you reading the situation?
In fact, we are just witnessing the evolution or the development of a situation that started already. I mean, in fact, it started, I mean, we could say 1 year, but if we're honest, it goes further before because um, everything started in October 2022 when General Surovikin, the commander of all Russian forces in Russia, said that from that point, I mean, that was on the 18th of October, by the way, he said, from that point, we are no longer making big operations on the ground, but we will grind down systematically and methodically the Ukrainian capacities. And that's exactly what they are doing. And this has been the Russian approach is incremental. Instead of striking right away with all maximal power, as the Americans tend to do, the Russians go progressively. And in fact, if we look at the whole conflict as it started on the 24th of February up to now, we could see that at the very beginning, and you may remember that the Russians moved very fast through the defense of the Ukrainians up to the point that they could reach Kiev. And in fact, you had almost no combat at that point. You know, the principle that was used by the Russians at that point was a principle that is, in German, you would say, fließendes Wasser. That means the flowing water. That means you don't stop in front of a stronghold or a fortified area or things like that. You bypass it and you move ahead in the depth of the enemy territory. And that's exactly what they have done, almost without fighting. And they wanted to reach a political agreement. That was the name of the game at that point. And that led, in fact, to the Istanbul negotiation. Now, once the Europeans stopped that process and made clear by providing weapons, intelligence, and all that, and we have seen that this the task force Dragon that was headquartered in Wiesbaden that provided intelligence to the Ukrainians. And at the same time, you had all these artillery pieces flowing into Ukraine, the M777, the Caesar, and all that. The Russians understood that the Europeans were determined to continue war. And therefore, they changed the approach. Instead of trying to make a political pressure to achieve a political result, they decided to grind down the armed force, the demilitarization, not politically, but militarily. And that's exactly what they have done. And we've seen a progression all over these years since October 2022. Now, it's also interesting to see that the Russians, because remember, they always see war as politics with other means, or the continuation of politics with other means, meaning that they don't want to destroy completely the Ukraine. They want to make pressure and addition new pressure and so on. They always keep an opportunity to increase further the pressure. So they will not start right away to destroy everything, but they will do it progressively in order to incite the Ukrainians and, of course, the Westerners to engage into negotiation. That's exactly what we are seeing now. Now, the problem is that with the time, as times goes, we see that neither the Ukrainians nor the Europeans are ready to make any concession, even to go into the negotiation process that Trump tried to put in place. As a result, now what we are witnessing now is that the Russians, they step up the pressure on Ukraine in order to force them to to go into negotiation, and it's all about that. And you notice that, in fact, the Russians, in terms of capabilities and armament and logistics and all that, they could uh, engage into deep operations as they did in February 2022. This would be no problem at all, but it's not the objective. Now, the objective is not to reach just a simple political objective and to have this political demilitarization, if I can put it that way, but they wanted to have a physical demilitarization. And they will use that tool in order to press the Ukrainians and the Europeans to the last limits, so that once, and that's where we're heading to, that at one point the Russians will have no other choice than negotiating. Since October 2022, they always had the choice, but they have chosen not to negotiate. But there will be a point where this choice will no longer exist. And and by doing so, the Russians, in fact, spare the lives of their own soldiers. And that's exactly what General Surovikin said at that time. The name of the game was to destroy physically the Ukrainian military potential while saving Russian potential. And that's exactly what they are doing. So they are not in a hurry to take territory, because it's not the idea. The territory which is taken simply because they the combatants are no longer here. They are trying to, in fact, if you look at all the battles we have seen in the various places, Bakrovsk and others, Bakhmut and Taretsk, and etc. The idea is to attract the Ukrainians into fire pockets and to destroy them systematically. Once the pocket has been, the content of the pocket, if you want, has been destroyed, then the Russians can move on. But this is not, the idea is not to take territory. The idea is to destroy the Ukrainian potential. And I think this is a huge mistake that the analysts and military analysts and I mean, if you, I don't dare to call them strategists, but if we had understood that from the very beginning, we could have saved a lot of Ukrainian lives. But the fact of the matter, we keep saying that the objective of the Russians is to take territory, and therefore we tend to force Ukraine to stick to every single square meter. And that's exactly what the Russians want, because that's where exactly they can use their artillery and use their assets to destroy the equipment. And now they do exactly the same thing. In fact, into in the rear area of Ukraine, and you have seen in the recent month that especially the Germans have said that they will move part of their armament industry into Ukraine. And Rheinmetall, in particular, has an agreement with Ukraine to have factories on Ukrainian territory. And therefore, that's it. Now, the Russians are also, by the same token, depleting the European potential, you see. So it's an extremely elaborate strategy from the Russian side, which to some extent has been, because we don't want to understand that, because we don't want to listen to the Russians. In fact, the Europeans have done exactly what the Russians, they couldn't have hoped better situation, because now the Ukrainian army is getting destroyed systematically, and there is a kind of a snowball effect, because the less troop they have, the less equipment they can manage and use. We have exactly what Zelensky used to say, and some also officials, Ukrainian officials, said, "Well, it's fine if you send us weapons, but what we need are not weapons. This is troops, because we don't have the people to put with those weapons." So we are now in this process in which the Russians are not only depleting the Ukrainian equipment, material, and troops, but they're also preventing somehow that new equipment, even if it comes into Ukraine, it will not be used because nobody will be able to use this equipment. So that's what we are witnessing. And I think the Russians have perfectly managed that. And we are exactly in that process. So we are definitely probably not yet at the breaking point, but we will come to the point where Ukraine will have absolutely no choice. It will be forced to negotiate. And we see this point is approaching, because we see now that we had those calls between Macron and Trump with Putin. They have not understood yet that they don't, even if there is a negotiation, they no longer have the freedom of negotiating the terms, because now clearly the Russians will define the terms, and that's what they haven't understood. And the more they wait, the less they will be able to negotiate the terms of any kind of agreement, and they can probably still at this stage decide that they don't want to negotiate, but there will be a point where they will have neither the choice to discuss or to negotiate the content of a negotiation, and they will not even be able to negotiate whether it should be a negotiation or not, because there will be no alternative to a negotiation.
It does remind me, in terms of the territory, of it seems like a dilemma because back in 2019, everyone, well, I think I've seen this RAND report, which is the think tank of the American intelligence community, where they kind of outlined that well, the conflict in Ukraine then was a good way of bleeding Russia by pulling in its resources. On the other hand, it also warned that if there would be a full-scale war, the problem would be that Ukraine could lose strategic territories, and that would be a loss. So as long as they could keep a war going and just gradually bleed Russia using the Ukrainians, that would be a plus. But the loss of strategic territories is when it would be a minus. So if you're sitting in Kremlin, you would think that if you take territory, this creates pressures on the West to negotiate. But also, it becomes more difficult, it would seem, to negotiate as the loss of these territories shifts some of the strategic landscape. But I do agree, though, that the main objective for Russia is, of course, to destroy the opponent, as this has become a war of attrition. But yeah, that kind of takes me back to
Oh,
my first
sorry.
point, though, is how much more can Ukraine actually take? Because it can't rebuild an army now anymore. With they're talking about conscription, widening the description. I know the advisor or former advisor of Zelensky Alexei Arestovich, he made the point that soon they will probably start to talk about more openly about conscripting women, uh, and but you know, this limits how many people you can get in. It limits how much more weapons can be sent, and if you don't have proper area defenses, they can be picked off, I guess. So, how do you see this continuing for much longer? I think I underestimated the resilience of Ukraine. They've been, in this fight for more than 3 years, taking a lot of, casualties. But this surely can't go on forever.
We have to be careful when we talk about, well, of course, Ukraine is resilient, but at the same time, it is resilient probably also because there is obviously kind of propaganda that hides the number of casualties. I mean, Ukraine is definitely bleeding, and strongly bleeding, but apparently even the Ukrainians are not sure how much people died, and therefore you haven't seen so much reaction in the population on that. Although we know that a lot of people now would accept to give up. I mean, almost half of the population would agree to give up the all the territories that have been already occupied by Russia and to achieve some kind of an agreement with Russia. In any case, the problem is it's always difficult to assess the ultimate resilience, if you want, because it depends on the level of conflict you want to achieve. Remember that during the Soviet times, you had already some kind of guerrilla and resistance movements existing since World War II up to the early 60s. You had those movements operating in Ukraine with the help, by the way, of the US mainly, but also the French and the British. So they are used to have this kind of guerrilla warfare, and that's probably where the conflict could head to a different type of conflict. And when we come to this different type of conflict, look at Israel and Gaza, for instance. You see, we even if Gaza is much smaller, with definitely much less capacities than Ukraine has, it still managed to keep Israel at bay. Meaning that with Ukraine, if we assume that we shift from conventional warfare into some kind of unconventional slash guerrilla warfare, this could certainly last for a very long time. The problem is that I'm not sure that the Ukrainians as a whole are ready, as the Palestinians are, to continue fighting as the Palestinians do, because the Palestinians are determined to keep their territories. The Ukrainians, remember that again, here it's important also to see the recent history, because for a lot of Ukrainians, Ukraine used to be part of Soviet Union. A big part of Ukraine is Russian speaking, meaning that for a lot of Ukrainians, the idea of national unity has a complete different meaning as you may have probably in Norway or in France or even in Switzerland, with despite the different ethnicities you have in Switzerland, because the country has been built up since 700 years. So, and in France it's almost the same, meaning that the sense of national unity, the sense of nationality as a fundamental concept is very different in the old Europe, as you may have in Ukraine, for instance. And probably when we talk about ultranationalists and all that, we are talking about a fraction of the Ukrainian population. And probably these guys are probably more, let's say, prone to defend and fight for their real territory. They never considered the eastern and southern part of Ukraine as their territory. And that's also very important. And that's what I try uh, show in my last book on the covert wars in Ukraine, where I explained that in the 50s, and I have some maps made by the CIA in the late 50s that show where the most Ukrainian population is, and it's very interesting because it corresponds to, if you look at the various elections that you had recently in Ukraine, it matches exactly with the map that was drawn by the CIA in the 50s, meaning that the nucleus of this Ukrainian nationalism is not in the center of Ukraine, is definitely on the west of Ukraine. And that's definitely a part of Ukraine that the Russians don't aim to take. When you listen to Vladimir Putin, he always talk about Novorossiya, and Novorossiya is composed by the four oblasts, those who are currently more or less, let's say 70%, 80% under Russian control, which are Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk. But in addition to that, when you talk about the concept of Novorossiya, then you add to this the oblast of Odessa, of Nikolaev, and Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkov. So four additional oblasts. And remember what recently Alexei Arestovich said. He said, well, if we don't negotiate now, probably the Russians will add four additional oblasts to what the one they have. And that's exactly that. And that's where we come into the definition of Novorossiya. But the Russians have never explicitly said that they want to move beyond the Dnieper, I mean, in the northern part, in the western part of Ukraine, if you want, because this is the most nationalist part and probably the most tricky to engage, especially if you consider the possibility of shifting in the kind of warfare we may have. So that I think is very important. So Ukraine can probably sustain more punishment. And remember that Russia has, the Soviet Union at the time has endured much more punishment during World War II. So Ukrainians can probably endure more. The problem is that there is a point where you start to think about what is at stake. When you talk about nationality, when the national interest or your national whatever you put in that word, then it has to have a meaning. And for a lot of Ukrainians, Ukraine, as we know from the borders of 1991, is probably not exactly what all the Ukrainians have in mind. And that's exactly where we may have this different approach. And the, um, the Russians may want to have an agreement before reaching the Dnieper. Probably not in the south. Probably they may want to go up to Odessa. That's possible, and that might be a probable evolution. If you listen to Medvedev, and so it might be something, but they definitely don't want to go in the western part of the country. And that's why probably they accelerate the pressure on Kiev to have a negotiation before they will be also forced to have a negotiation. Because at one point, assuming that there is no negotiation, certainly you will have the Ukraine will shrink, if I can put it that way. But there is a point where the Russians don't want to go, because then we come into the very nationalist part of Ukraine, and they don't want to be engaged in some kind of guerrilla warfare that would be endless. They want to stop before that. Therefore, there is a point of balance where both Ukrainians and Russians will probably find necessary to go on the negotiation table. And that's probably what we have. Now, you mentioned the Rand Corporation report on extending Russia that was published in spring 2019, where the interesting point in that report, because as you rightly said, they said that trying to weaken Russia may lead to, in fact, to sacrifice Ukraine to some extent. But what is very interesting in that document is that they say that most probably the assessment we have at that time on Russia is wrong, and that probably Russia has much stronger capabilities and capacities than we tend to assess at that point. And that's a very interesting point because, as you know, and as you rightly said at the beginning of this meeting, I used to be from strategic intelligence. And I always said the worst mistake you can make in warfare is to underestimate your enemy. And that's exactly what we have done because we wanted to portray Russia as a weak state, as something that is ready to be ready to collapse and all that. And remember everything we have heard since February 2022 with all the sanctions and all that. And that indicates that, in fact, we have pushed Ukraine into a conflict where the enemy was in reality much stronger than what we portrayed to the Ukrainians. And that's not only a mistake, it's, I would say, it's almost criminal.
Yeah, but it hasn't changed any of the strategy, it seems. We're still fighting as if it will be the same. But some of the warfare, though, has changed dramatically throughout the war. I mean, in the beginning phases, there was hardly any drones. It appears that the Europeans are banking on simply supplying more cheap drones, that hoping that cheap drones can bleed, well, kill Russian soldiers, but also bleed its expensive military equipment. While on the Russian side, it doesn't seem that this is a leading concern anymore. That is the drones. How do you see the evolvement of the war? Are the Europeans just reaching for straws, or is this strategy of just supplying as many drones as possible a good approach?
You know, it's interesting because, first of all, we have to remember that the first drone was conceived or designed in World War One. In fact, surprisingly, of course, it was not designed as it is today. But the first guided bomb, TV guided bomb, came into World War Two. So you know, everything we see today is in fact in much larger number and all that. And of course, in World War II, these were more or less experimental issues. But I mean, the technology is not new. And there is a tendency that when we see a new technology, we think it will dominate the battlefield. That was the same with the tank, that was the same with the aircraft, that was the same with guided artillery and missiles and all that. The thing is that regardless of the type of equipment you have, it can be successful only if it is well integrated into a sound and consistent battle concept, into a doctrine, if you prefer. And that's in fact the weakness of the Ukrainians. They may have a number of drones, but you cannot win a war with drones alone. You know, as you can't win a war just with aviation, as you can't win a war just with tanks. It has to be complemented by something, and this whole approach of the battlefield must be consistent. This is in essence that's the what the Germans in fact realized with the so-called blitzkrieg, which in fact has never been a German term by the official term, but okay, wait. But this combined arm operations, this is exactly the secret of the success. Then you can play with different type of weapons combined in one concept, and the your tool is not the individual weapons, but it's the all the weapons combined. And that's exactly the difference you have if you look at the battlefield, exactly the difference you have between Ukrainians and the Russians. The Russians have an approach of the operational art at large and an approach to the battlefield in as a whole thing. I mean, the artillery, infantry, tanks, drones, and all that are combined into one system. They have a systemic approach of the battlefield. While the Ukrainians, for various reasons, also because they were provided with equipment that they could not integrate into their doctrine, because this equipment was so different, so specific in terms of use. Look at, for instance, artillery. The Russian artillery is still based on this idea that you use massive fire, artillery fire, in order to support tanks and infantry and all that. Now, the M777, the US M777, or the French Caesar that was provided to Ukrainians, is not designed around this kind of doctrine. It's completely different. I mean, we could probably better describe those equipment as part of a sniping artillery, meaning that these are extremely precise weapons that you can use to destroy a very specific target. In you don't need to have a massive fire, but you just need to know the coordinate of your objective and you destroy with one shot. This is like a sniper, if you want. The problem is that you realize, if I take the analogy with a sniper and a machine gun, you understand these are two different things. The sniper can eliminate a single target very precisely, neatly, while the machine gun doesn't need to kill necessarily, but the machine gun provides a such massive fire that you cannot move in front of it. And the use of those weapons are in fact complementary. And that's exactly the same with artillery. And therefore, the Ukrainians had a concept of artillery which was at the beginning of the war very close to the one of the Russians. And suddenly they had weapons that were not designed to achieve very high rate of fire. I mean, in Afghanistan, the Americans used to fire in Iraq. The Americans used to fire something like 700 artillery rounds per day, while in the early phase of the war, I mean, I'm talking about 2022 or something like that in Ukraine, the Russians were firing something like 40,000 rounds of artillery per day. So we are here facing a two different concepts. And the problem is that the Ukrainians have never been in a position to integrate the European concept of artillery into their own doctrinal operational concept. And therefore, the Ukrainians have never managed to have a system on the battlefield. They have a lot of weapons, it's kind of a patchwork of different weapons, but they are not consistently bound together into a system. And that applies to the drones as well. If you look on the Russian side they had the drone before, but now they have integrated the drone. I mean, we have to make the difference here between the drones that are used for those strategic strikes, like all the Geran drones that are used every night together with missiles against targets in the depth of Ukraine. That's one thing. But now, if we just take the battlefield and what's happening on the battlefield, you will say that the Russians have managed to better integrate the drones, the small drone FPV drones and things like that, into their command and control structure than the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have still separate command structures for the drones and others. And that's where you have a fundamental weakness in Ukraine, because the Europeans and the Westerners have put emphasis on providing a lot of different type of weapons, but they almost neglected the integration of these weapons into something. Then, of course, you have a lot of drones, and they probably destroy a lot of things, and they probably kill a lot of Russians. It's possible, but they are not integrated into a system that in itself is able to provide success. Because at the end of the day, the success, the operational success, is not the addition of all the tactical successes. There is not a linear relation. The same, it's not because all your battalions have a success that you will have an operational success and so on up to the strategic level. In fact, there is a non-linear relationship between the success, and that's exactly what the Russians have understood, and that's exactly why the exactly what we have seen, for instance, in the very beginning of this conflict, by having deep penetrating operations into Ukraine, these, even if they didn't kill much people, but it had a multiplier effect on the decision made by the Ukraine, because at the end Zelensky was forced at this stage to go into negotiation, even if he had not suffered as many casualties as he had now. So we see that here there are two different approaches. We tend in the West to see the success as something which is linear, that you can add. It's just related to the number of square kilometers you protect or keep, and the number of people you kill. While on the Russian side, they have a much more qualitative approach of the conflict, meaning that for them, they don't need to have a lot of people, they don't to take risks for their own people. They have as an objective to destroy the Ukrainian potential, but it's not related to the number of square kilometers they gain. And this may even not be the case at all. I mean, in the best case for the Ukrainians would like to proceed in order to regain territory, and the Russians will just wait for them and destroy them, and they don't need to have territory. So we have totally different approach of the battlefield, and that, I think, is something that the West, because the West, by waging wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq and elsewhere, they have lost this ability to understand the operational level at war. They conduct tactical wars, and that's a fundamental weakness of the Western military. While the Russians have always considered that the operational, and it's also interesting to see that they call that operational art. It's more than warfare. It's operational art. It's an art, and it's not just a technique. The tactics is a technical level. They are not interested in that. I mean, it's not they're not interested, but I mean they see it as a very mechanical level, if you want. While the operational art is exactly where you need to have concepts that where you can express the, let's say, your imagination, your fantasy, if I can use that word in that context, and and that's the operational art is the core of the military thinking in Russia. And in order to achieve that, you need to have a system that you can use. You cannot use just simply just tanks or just drones or just that and this. This has to be a system. And therefore, in when we look at the Ukrainian conflict and we look at the Ukrainian side, they tend to rely exclusively on drones. But I'm not. I mean, again, I may be wrong, but I don't have a crystal ball. But in my view, this is not conducive to success. This is kind of a, let's say, satisfaction, a, a, a temporary satisfaction, because you destroy this and that, but you don't achieve operational success. You have a lot of small tactical successes, maybe, but they don't materialize into something bigger. And that's exactly what we have seen the last 2 years in Ukraine. Therefore, yes, the battlefield has changed. Yes, today there's more emphasis on drones, but on the Western side, I think we haven't taken all the advantage, or less, we haven't taken advantage of these the drones into a more comprehensive understanding of the battlefield.
Do we know anything else about the Russian strategy? Because, well, at least they appear to have one, and on the battlefield, because not only are they overwhelming now with air power, but it looks as if, and some several points on the front lines, there's points which are breaking, and the Russians, they built up a very powerful force. A lot of the armored vehicles are being sent to the rear. Are they looking for when the front line breaks to take max advantage of this, or is this simply building up capabilities in case the conflict, I guess, widens and they end up in a direct war with the West? Or because I'm seeing a little bit what you spoke about earlier as well, that they're not in a rush always to take territory. I see they often form cauldrons, which they could close off completely, but instead they seem to wait for the Ukrainians to continue to send men into the cauldron to hold strategic territory. Instead, use it as an opportunity to just bleed out the forces of the enemy. But I guess on on the wider picture here, what do we know about Russia's approach besides trying to, destroy? Well, again, this is a war of attrition. So besides destroying the military hardware and Ukrainian soldiers, which they're fighting against.
You see, if we put it extremely simply, uh, the Russian approach, and remember what Vladimir Putin said on the 24th of February 2022. He said we have two objectives: demilitarization and denazification. At that stage, that meant something very tactical, in fact, or probably tactical operational, if you want, at that stage. Today, this is the same objective, but this objective has moved towards something more strategic. And if we continue into that logic, we see if there is no Ukrainian army anymore, then there will be no NATO request anymore. You see, I mean, I put it that's extremely simply, but I think that's probably a little bit how the Russians see the problem. They say, well, you want to continue fighting? Fine, but then we'll destroy everything. And if you want to go into NATO, there will be nothing left to be part of NATO. And again, this is an oversimplification of the Russian thinking, but it goes a little bit in that direction. And that we can see that the Russians have done that extremely progressively, and they increased the pressure. And today we have seen that they have increased their operations on the in the strategic depth of Ukraine with all these strikes on Zhytomyr and other places in the depths, I mean, in the western part of Ukraine. And we see that it has been intensified. The number of drones and missiles has increased significantly, meaning that the Russians are determined to increase that pressure up to the point that again, Ukraine will be forced into negotiation. They will have no chance. And at the same time, they deplete systematically what you have on the front line. And this has two implications. The first is obviously that it weakens the front line and the battlefront, so to say. But it has a secondary effect, is that in order to continue fighting, the Ukrainians need to recruit more people. And by recruiting forcefully people, because now we see that the Ukrainians don't want to go into fighting. And there was recently, I don't have the reference right now in mind, but it was even in Ukrainian media, by the way. They said that about 80% of the new people sent to the front line today are forced recruited people, 80%. Meaning that these people, first of all, they are not really battle ready in the sense that they are not trained extensively to fight. They are probably not even willing to fight. That's a thing. But in the rear, you have a population that is increasingly angry at the government precisely because all these their sons, their husbands, their fathers are recruited forcefully. And if you see all these uh, the, the the small video you see on Telegram showing this forcefully recruitment. And by the way, you have a law now in Ukraine that prohibits to to record this recruitment because they see that it has a decisive impact on the population. And in my book Covert Wars against in Ukraine, I noticed that now in the part of Ukraine which is controlled by Kiev, you have, of course, you have Russian resistance movements. They exist and they fight. I mean, it's more sabotage action than things like this. You have those ones, but you also have Ukrainian resistance movement in the Kiev controlled zone. And the main rationale for these movements to fight against the Kiev regime is precisely forceful recruitment. And at the end, it's very interesting. You have certain of these movements. They cooperate with the Russian resistance movement. They pass information to the Russians, and you have these movements, even if they are, I would say, ethnically, if you allow me that expression, they're ethnically different, and they have different objectives. They are not exactly the same objectives. They are fighting against the same adversary, but not with the same rationale. But nevertheless, they realize that they have a common adversary and they exchange information. And you have a lot of information that comes to the Russian intelligence that comes, in fact, from Ukrainian resistance movement. And so that means that depleting the forces on the front line has also an impact deeply into the Ukrainian society at large, and that contributes to the weakening of the Kiev government. And that, I think, it's a very important aspect of it, even if we may not see. And I also think that we have limited information coming from this, what's happening within Ukraine, because you have a very strong repression. SBU is extremely active. You have kind of counter, they call it counter terrorist, but it's kind of counter guerrilla type of activities to fight against those Ukrainian movement as well as against the Russian resistance movement. So we don't know much what's going on there, but it's happening, and it's part of the whole picture that the Russians have. And when the Russians, for instance, they try to track down all these factories, the drone factories or other factories, because I mentioned before that some Western companies tried to establish factories within Ukraine. I mentioned Rheinmetall. Of course, you will not have a big factory, a huge factory, and things like this. This will be scattered around different smaller factories. It is extremely complex process, and it's also very difficult to track down where those factories are. And a lot of information about the location of these factories are in fact provided to the Russians by the resistance movement, and mostly Ukrainian movement. If we talk about what's happening in the western part of Ukraine, I mean Lvov, Rovno, and all that, all these areas are very nationalistic areas, and but they are also the place where you have Ukrainian resistance movement, and that in fact helps to this information goes to the Russians. And incidentally, recently I read It's very interesting that you have, even in the most nationalistic part of Ukraine, you have people who start to think that Kiev should stop because Ukraine would disappear. And therefore, for nationalistic reasons, they would like a Kiev to negotiate with the Russians, meaning that you have also an opposition building up within the nationalist movement in Ukraine. So it's very paradoxical and very poorly understood in the West. But I think the strategy that is used by the Russians in order to weaken the Ukrainian forces on the front lines and in the rear as well, it has strong implications and strong impact on the Ukrainian society at large, and it contributes to the weakening of the regime, if I can use that word for Kiev.
Well, it does make sense, I guess, this nationalist opposition to Zelensky, because again, the war is destroying Ukraine. Not only are they losing territory, but again, an entire generation of men are disappearing. Even if you want to rebuild the country after this war, which is going to be a very difficult task, you do need actual men to still be alive. This fighting to the last man. This is, it's not automatically some patriotic position to take. I was actually thinking something along the lines of what you said about the recruitment centers, because it seems as of lately the Russians have stepped up efforts in attacking the recruitment centers as well. And I thought this could have a dual effect. Yes, on one hand, they can slow down the recruitment, but if there's I guess a battle for the hearts and minds. I guess this, of all targets, this is the one that could meet more sympathy among the actual
Absolutely.
Ukrainian population. So,
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And I said that the attacks against those so-called TCCs, which are those recruitment centers, I said a lot of information about those centers is provided by the Ukrainian resistance. So this is something that we don't want to understand in Europe, because we still want this image of Ukraine united against the Russians, and remember at the very beginning of the conflict, I remember especially in the French media, they used to say that the Ukrainians will never accept any kind of Russian occupation, and they will fight in occupied territories. In fact, we see that it's absolutely not the case. The Russians have probably anticipated some kind of resistance movement, let's put it that way, and they have very quickly rebuilt the countries. Cities like Mariupol, for instance, have been at a very high speed. They have been rebuilt and modernized, and having provided with huge shopping centers and things like that, so that the population can see a benefit to be ruled by the Russians, if I can put it that way. Even if a big part of the population in this area is of Russian extraction, in fact, have their family in Russia, have been in fact subject. I could even say that it was more like a Ukrainian occupation so far than today a Russian occupation. But it is a matter of it may be very politically incorrect to say so. But nevertheless, the fact is that the Russians have made every effort to make life in the place they occupy, to make life much better. They improved the road system, and I have been in Ukraine in 2014, and the road network was absolutely dramatic in the south. It was very difficult to move even on highway at full speed with the car, because you had holes everywhere on the road. It was not maintained. It was in very poor condition, and we are still not at war. So everything that the Russians have built in the area they occupy is used as a kind of a showcase for the rest of Ukraine. And that's very interesting, that a lot of people even in Odessa, for instance, although Odessa is essentially a Russian city, but there is a strong Ukrainian presence. But it is also a place where you have very strong resistance, Ukrainian resistance movement against Kiev. And all this resistance movement, as you rightly said, was in fact triggered by the forced recruitment. And I also interpreted the attack against those centers by the Russians as a kind of as I said, as you rightly said, a heart and mind operation. Absolutely.
Well, it's I I was thinking with this yeah other attacks the well no, no sorry not just attacks the ability to rebuild the regions. I think this has been a it coincides a bit with the rhetoric which has changed in Moscow because when the war began there was a lot of talk about we're brotherly region, we're brotherly peoples. The NATO got in the middle. Let's find a settlement to this. But as the war of attrition drags on, and Russia doesn't see any political settlement, it goes more for the territory. The rhetoric has changed a bit. So you see now more talk about Ukraine being essentially an artificial state. So I guess, as you suggested, the ability to sell it as Ukraine was a failed experiment. Effectively, they had 30 years, 30 plus years to develop the country. It didn't work. Nothing was modernized, and now when they effectively returned to Russia, they're immediately modernized and they're brought up to speed, and the former problems goes away. I mean, it could be a powerful way of selling the annexations to Ukrainians. I'm not saying most are going to go for this, but this appears to be the kind of the storyline that Russia is going for. But
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And the thing is, I think Volodymyr Zelensky made a huge mistake in 2021 when this law was passed by the parliament on the 1st of July, which is the law on the how's it called that? It's indigenous people. It's the law on the indigenous people of Ukraine that defines, in fact, who has the right to be called indigenous to Ukraine or not. And the law makes very clear that the Russians are not considered as an indigenous people of Ukraine. As a result, and that was said by various MPs after the vote, after the acceptation of the law, that from that point, that means July 2021, the Russians or the Russian citizens, I mean the citizens who are Russian extraction, would not benefit from the same human rights and the same rights provided by the Ukrainian constitutions as the other indigenous people of Ukraine, meaning that the Russians were then considered as second-class citizens. And that, in fact, creates an incentive for all those people of Russian extraction not to return in any case to under the rule of Kiev. And in fact, this law has become the rationale for which the four oblasts that we have mentioned before, the Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk, that's the rationale for the Russians not to give those oblasts back, because they say, well, we came, and that's exactly what Vladimir Putin said on the 24th of February. He said, we are intervening to protect the population of Ukraine, the Russians' population in Ukraine. And therefore, now, today, we will not, if they are under Russian rule, that means they will be considered as normal citizens. If we return those oblasts to Kiev, they will be considered as second-class citizens, and we don't want to do that. So this law of July 2021 has become kind of a trap for Zelensky and the Ukrainian government. And at the same time, it has become an incentive for the Russian ethnic Russians in Ukraine to be under Russian rule. And that's a very interesting point because nobody has mentioned that, and that's precisely the reason why nobody mentions this law in the West, because this law, it has been, by the way, some compared this law with the so-called Nuremberg laws of 1935. Where the Germans tried to make a difference between ethnic Germans and uh, non-ethnic Germans, let's say, and if that includes, obviously, or were directed at the Jews in particular, meaning that you had two class of citizens, and the one class had not the same right as the other. And of course, the law in Ukraine is not as tough as the German law was in 1935. In any case, this is the same spirit. It's the same idea that you grant rights on individuals based on what they are and not what they are doing. And that's something which is, for people like me, in Switzerland, when we have where we have three or even four different ethnicities, it's unthinkable to have a law that make a difference between Swiss German, Swiss French, Swiss Italian, or Romansh people. And this is something that is absolutely unthinkable. And in a democratic rule of law type of country, you cannot have this kind of distinction between individuals. But even if it's not as tough as we may think, the law in Ukraine make that difference. And this is fundamental. And I think it contradicts all declaration in the West that Ukraine is democratic and all that. Because this is when you start to make a distinction between your citizens based on ethnicity, then you are no longer in what we consider as the values that we have for our states. I think we are beyond that in any case. In any case, this is a very important aspect of that of the situation, and I think it will feed the Russian narrative more and more. And remember, this map that Medvedev uh, has published, I mean, probably 2 years ago, something like that. He made a map, or of course, that was provocative as it usually does, but um, he made a map of what Ukraine may look like. And he showed a Ukraine that was reduced to a very small portion of territory in the center, because he anticipated that the Transcarpathian, for instance, would be returned to Hungary and to Romania, and a part of Galicia would be returned to Poland, and the Russian-speaking part would be returned to Russia, and therefore the Ukrainian part would be reduced to something extremely small. And we are probably heading towards something like this, by the way. Again, okay, it's probably too early to make this kind of assessment, but I think that's something at least we should think about when we start to think about how we want to stop this conflict. Because if there is no move towards a negotiated process, then we might eventually arrive to the point where Ukraine will partly at least disappear. The issue of the minorities is something that we tend to ignore in the West. But if you look at it from, let's say, just an Hungarian point of view, this is exactly the reason why Hungary has always refused to have weapons transiting on its territory to reach Ukraine, because the Hungarian minority in Ukraine has been constantly under exactions of the nationalists, the Ukrainian nationalists, since 2014. And it has been the subject of several complaints to the Council of Europe by Hungary in order to, because they expected Europe to take measures in order to protect this minority. So the Romanian minority is probably too small to have any impact. But the Hungarians have been extremely worried about the situation of their own minority. So if we reach a situation where you have a decomposition of the government in Kiev, they might well claim those territories, and they may probably even trigger some movement in Transcarpathia, movement that claim or want to be reintegrated into Hungary. Uh, I don't know. I mean, this is we are now in the completely speculative thinking, but the problem is that because we ignore that now, we may reach the point where those speculation may become reality. You see, that's why we need to be, in my view, more anticipative when we talk about this kind of thing, or consider the end of the conflict in terms of negotiations.
Well, to bring up Alexander uh, Arestovich again, sorry. The former advisor of Zelensky, he made a similar comment, actually many times, that by alienating or calling millions of their own citizens as second-rate citizens, that they lost, the loyalty of many, many people who could have been loyal supporters and defenders of Ukraine, and instead maybe not make them switch sides, but at least yeah, make them question their loyalty to Ukraine. So, but also on another level, the complete silence from the so-called liberal democracies in the West, who were supposed to stand up for key principles, which were supposed to be elevated above geopolitics, which turned out that they pretended it didn't exist, that this is somehow Russian propaganda or something. Just my last question is just on the solution here, or the end to the war. Do you think the time for a peaceful settlement has been lost? Is this going to be resolved by a military solution?
To be honest, I don't think that such a conflict can be solved exclusively by military action. I mean, this was, remember, Josep Borrell, the former head of the European Union External Action Service, the foreign minister of the European Union, if you prefer, he used to say that this conflict would end on the battlefield. Um, and of course, that was the European position because they considered that Ukraine would win and therefore defeat decisively the Russians. I'm not sure that the Russians are see the problem like this, and that's the reason why they have always been open to any political solution to the conflict. And my view is that you cannot solve such a conflict just by force. You need, when you have this kind of the ethnicity and this kind of problems, you cannot solve that just militarily. You can probably solve a conflict militarily when the problem is merely material or physical, if you want to take territory or things like that. But as soon as you have an ethnicity element in the rationale of the actors, then it has to be something that both parties agree upon. And therefore, I think we will not avoid a political solution. The problem is at which point. You see, in April 2022, we could have reached a point where a political solution was acceptable and agreeable on both sides. but the West, and the West, not the Ukrainians, because I remind you that this agreement of April 2022 came at the initiative of the Ukrainians, not at the initiative of the Russians. And therefore, the Ukrainians have understood that at that point, or Zelensky. The problem is that the Europeans refused that. So that's extremely odd. But and the Europeans have in fact and still are against any kind of negotiation. But the problem is that the Russians have understood that, and now they say, okay, you don't want negotiation. Then we increase the pressure up to the point that you will be forced to have a negotiation. And as I said before, the first sign of this is this move that you have within the European Union. And remember that the Slovenian prime minister recently said that the European Union should have a team that start thinking about a negotiation with Russia. So it's not even the Slovaks, which obviously are, but the Slovens. So we see that within European Union, the lines are moving a little bit, and people start thinking. And then you had this discussion in March this year about having some kind of representative of the European Union to open dialogue with Russia. And as Kaya Kallas suggested that she would be the contact point, Prime Minister Sanchez of Spain said, "Well, you must be joking, because this is certainly not you who will be the first the first point of contact with Russia. It's not possible." That was Emmanuel Macron that proclaimed himself as this contact point. He did nothing up to last week or so, and now he has started the negotiation. But again, since he doesn't understand the whereabouts of the conflict, this led nowhere. But at least it shows that the Europeans have realized that there will be a point where negotiation will be unavoidable, and that the more they wait, the less they will have the choice of the time in which they want to start the negotiation. And today, definitely the Russians are the masters of the time, and this will increase with time. If the Europeans want to have any chance of having some word to say in that process, they have to act very fast. But they are not ready to do so. And acting fast is not just calling Russia fast, is also to realize that the situation has changed, and you cannot have the same demands toward Russia as you had probably 2, 3, or 10 years ago. The demands have changed because the situation has changed on the ground. And today, as we say in French, the Russians hold the knife by the handle. That means that they are in control of the situation, and this will increase with time. So the more we wait, and the more the Europeans wait, and the more the Europeans try to avoid any kind of discussion between Ukraine and Russia, the more they wait on this, the more it will increase the power of Russia. And that's something that could be identified. And in my first book on the conflict, Operation Z, I wrote it already. The book was published in autumn 2022, because that's exactly what we could anticipate based on the situation on the ground at that time. Because the Ukrainian army had been already depleted in May, June 2022. That's the reason why Zelensky came in April, just before the army was completely destroyed, and that he had to rely on Western aid. And before reaching that point, Zelensky wanted to have an agreement. That's the reason why he came in mid-March to talk with the Russians. The Europeans didn't want this, so what should happen happened. That means that Zelensky himself said in June 2022 that from that point, that was early June 2022, he said from that point we depend exclusively on Western military aid. That means that the old Ukrainian army had been destroyed. And the situation worsened in 2023 and in 2024. And today it's even worse because now the Westerners have no longer the ability to support just because they don't have the equipment. And that's all the debate we have with all those Patriots, interceptors, HIMARS missiles, Stinger, and all that. You know, the problem is that now even the US, who used to be the so-called arsenal of democracy, has no longer the ability to support both Israel and Ukraine. And if we put the two in balance, Israel will always have the priority towards Ukraine. This is no question about this. Therefore, we are in a situation where the more time goes, the more the Ukrainians will be, in fact, in an awkward position, will be in fact, in a dead end, you know. And that's exactly where the Europeans are leading Europe, or the Europeans are leading Ukraine now. They are leading them into a dead end. And that would be tragic for Ukraine.
Very much agree. Well, Colonel Baud, thank you so much for being very generous with your time and sharing your insights. So thanks again.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.